How was Chicago in 1850? An overview of Chicago in 1850. Chapter 1: The Rising City. The year 1850 marked a pivotal moment in the history of Chicago. Standing at the crossroads of American expansion, this young city was transforming from a modest frontier settlement into what would become one of the most significant urban centers in the United States. To understand Chicago in 1850, one must first appreciate the remarkable journey that brought this city from its humble origins to its emerging prominence. Just 17 years earlier, in 1833, Chicago had been incorporated as a town with a population of merely 350 residents. By 1837, it had achieved city status with approximately 4,170 inhabitants. The growth that occurred between these early years and 1850 was nothing short of extraordinary. When the federal census was conducted in 1850, Chicago's population had exploded to nearly 30,000 people, representing one of the fastest growth rates of any American city during this period. This phenomenal expansion was not accidental. Chicago's geographical position made it uniquely suited to become a commercial powerhouse. Situated at the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, at the junction of the Great Lakes water system and the vast prairie lands stretching westward, Chicago occupied what many recognized as the most strategic location in the American interior. The Chicago River, with its north and south branches, provided natural harbors and waterways that facilitated trade and transportation. In 1850, visitors arriving in Chicago would have encountered a city pulsating with energy and ambition. The streets were filled with merchants, farmers, laborers, speculators, and dreamers from across the nation and around the world. The sound of construction echoed throughout the city as new buildings rose almost daily. Wagons loaded with grain, lumber, and livestock crowded the muddy thoroughfares. The waterfront buzzed with activity as ships arrived and departed, carrying goods and passengers between Chicago and ports across the Great Lakes. The atmosphere of Chicago in 1850 was one of unbridled optimism. Despite the challenges of living in a rapidly growing frontier city, residents believed they were participating in something historic. Newspaper editorials proclaimed Chicago's destiny to become the great metropolis of the West. Businessmen invested their fortunes in real estate, commerce, and infrastructure, confident that their investments would multiply as the city continued its upward trajectory. Yet beneath this optimism lay the raw realities of frontier urban life. Chicago in 1850 was still a work in progress, with all the problems that accompanied rapid, often unplanned growth. The streets were unpaved and notorious for their mud. Sanitation was primitive, and disease posed constant threats to public health. Crime flourished in certain quarters, and law enforcement remained rudimentary. The city lacked the refined cultural institutions that characterized older Eastern cities. But these deficiencies did little to dampen the enthusiasm of Chicago's residents, who viewed such problems as temporary obstacles on the path to greatness. The demographic composition of Chicago in 1850 reflected the diverse streams of migration that fed the city's growth. Native-born Americans from New England, New York, and the older Midwestern states formed a significant portion of the population. These migrants brought with them the commercial acumen, Protestant religious traditions, and civic values of their home regions. Many became the city's leading merchants, professionals, and political figures. Alongside these native-born Americans came waves of immigrants from Europe. The Irish, fleeing the devastating potato famine that had ravaged their homeland, arrived in large numbers during the late 1840s. By 1850, Irish immigrants and their children constituted a substantial segment of Chicago's population, concentrated largely in the working class. They provided much of the labor that built the city's infrastructure, working on canal projects, railroad construction, and building sites. German immigrants also arrived in significant numbers, bringing skills in trades and crafts that contributed to Chicago's economic development. Unlike the Irish, who faced severe discrimination, Germans often found somewhat easier paths to economic advancement. They established businesses, formed cultural organizations, and created distinct neighborhoods where German language and customs prevailed. Smaller numbers of immigrants from Scandinavian countries, Britain, and other European nations added to Chicago's ethnic diversity. This mixture of peoples from different backgrounds created a dynamic but sometimes volatile social environment. Competition for jobs, differences in religion and culture, and prejudices imported from the Old World all contributed to tensions within the growing population. The physical footprint of Chicago in 1850 was still relatively compact by later standards, but it was expanding rapidly in all directions. The central business district, concentrated near the junction of the Chicago River's branches, contained the city's most substantial commercial buildings. Moving outward from this core, residential neighborhoods housed populations of varying economic status. The wealthy built substantial homes near the lakefront and along fashionable streets, while working-class families crowded into more modest dwellings in less desirable locations. Transportation within the city relied primarily on foot, horseback, and horse-drawn vehicles. The streets, arranged in a grid pattern, facilitated movement, but became nearly impassable during wet weather when mud could swallow wagons up to their axles. Plank roads provided some relief on major thoroughfares, but maintaining these wooden roadways proved an ongoing challenge. Chicago's connection to the outside world in 1850 was increasingly defined by the transportation revolution that was reshaping America. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, completed in 1848, linked Chicago to the Mississippi River system, opening markets throughout the interior of the continent. Lake Michigan connected the city to the entire Great Lakes region and, through the Erie Canal, to the eastern seaboard. Most significantly, railroad construction was just beginning to transform Chicago's position in the national economy. In 1848, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad had inaugurated service, becoming the first railroad to operate out of Chicago. By 1850, this pioneering line was expanding, and plans for additional railroad connections were moving forward. Visionary businessmen and civic leaders recognized that railroads would multiply Chicago's advantages of location, making it the hub of a vast transportation network. The railroad era was dawning, and Chicago was positioning itself to become its greatest beneficiary. The economy of Chicago in 1850 was fundamentally oriented toward commerce, rather than manufacturing. The city served as an entrepot, a collection and distribution point for the agricultural products of the surrounding region. Grain, particularly wheat and corn from the prairies of Illinois and beyond, flowed into Chicago for shipment to eastern markets. Lumber from the forests of Wisconsin and Michigan arrived by lake and was sold to builders throughout the treeless prairies. Livestock, provisions, and countless other goods passed through the city's warehouses and docks. This commercial economy supported a variety of businesses and occupations. Merchants, commission agents, warehouse operators, and shipping companies formed the upper tier of the commercial structure. Clerks, bookkeepers, and salesmen occupied intermediate positions. Laborers, dock workers, teamsters, and servants provided the muscle that kept goods moving. Small manufacturers, artisans, and tradespeople produced goods and services for the local market. The governmental structure of Chicago in 1850 was still developing. The city operated under a charter granted by the Illinois state legislature, which established a mayor-council form of government. The mayor, elected by popular vote, served as the chief executive officer. A common council composed of aldermen from each ward exercised legislative authority. The powers of city government remained limited, with minimal provision for public services that later generations would take for granted. Politics in Chicago reflected the national divisions of the era. The Democratic Party dominated local politics for much of the 1840s, drawing support from immigrant communities and working-class voters. The Whig Party, representing commercial and professional interests, offered opposition, but struggled to achieve consistent electoral success. Emerging issues, particularly those related to slavery and territorial expansion, were beginning to reshape political alignments, foreshadowing the rise of the Republican Party later in the decade. Religious institutions played important roles in the social life of Chicago in 1850. Protestant churches, representing various denominations including Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Episcopal, and Congregational, served the city's native-born population and some immigrant groups. The growing Irish population supported Catholic parishes that became centers of community life. German immigrants established both Catholic and Lutheran congregations. Churches provided not only spiritual guidance, but also social services, charitable assistance, and community identity in a rapidly changing environment. Education in Chicago remained a work in progress. Public schools existed, but served only a fraction of the school-age population. Many children received education through private academies, church schools, or not at all. The quality of instruction varied widely, and educational opportunities were limited for children from poor families. Higher education was virtually non-existent in Chicago, with young people seeking advanced learning required to travel to established institutions in the East or Europe. Cultural life in Chicago in 1850 reflected the city's youth and frontier character. Theaters and lecture halls provided entertainment and intellectual stimulation. Newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, founded in 1847, and the Chicago Democrat, kept residents informed about local, national, and international events. Libraries remained private or subscription-based, with public library service still years in the future. Literary and scientific societies gathered the city's intellectual elite for discussions and presentations. As 1850 drew to a close, Chicago stood poised for even greater growth. The foundations that would support the city's rise to metropolitan status were being laid. The population was growing, commerce was expanding, and transportation connections were multiplying. Problems remained, certainly, but the overall trajectory pointed unmistakably upward. Chicago in 1850 was a city of the future, a place where ambition, opportunity, and geography combined to create conditions for remarkable development. Chapter 2: The Physical Landscape and Urban Development. The physical setting of Chicago in 1850 presented both opportunities and challenges for the city's development. Understanding this landscape is essential to comprehending how Chicago grew and why its residents faced particular problems in their efforts to build a great city. Chicago occupied a site that was, in many respects, remarkably flat. The terrain rose only slightly from the shores of Lake Michigan as one moved westward across the prairie. This lack of topographical variation meant that natural drainage was poor, leading to persistent problems with standing water, mud, and marshy conditions. The elevation of much of the city stood only a few feet above the level of the lake, leaving low-lying areas susceptible to flooding during storms or periods of high water. The Chicago River, which had attracted settlement to this location in the first place, both blessed and cursed the city. Its three branches, the main stem flowing into Lake Michigan, the north branch extending northward, and the south branch reaching southwest, provided natural waterways for shipping and commerce. Vessels could navigate these branches to reach warehouses and businesses located along their banks. However, the river also created barriers to movement within the city, requiring bridges that frequently interrupted traffic and needed constant maintenance. The soil underlying Chicago was predominantly clay, which contributed to the infamous mud that visitors and residents alike found so troublesome. When rain fell or snow melted, the clay retained water and created a thick, sticky mud that could be nearly impossible to traverse. Stories abounded of horses and wagons sinking deep into the mire, of men losing boots in the mud, and of entire vehicles disappearing into particularly treacherous spots. The mud of Chicago became legendary, a constant source of complaint and dark humor among those who experienced it. By 1850, efforts to improve street conditions were underway, but remained inadequate to the challenge. Plank roads, constructed by laying wooden boards across the muddy thoroughfares, provided some relief on major streets. These planks offered a relatively solid surface for travel, though they quickly deteriorated under heavy traffic and weather exposure. Maintaining plank roads required constant attention and expense, and many streets remained entirely unpaved. The waterfront along Lake Michigan and the Chicago River was the heart of the city's commercial life. Wharves and docks extended into the water, allowing ships to load and unload cargo. Warehouses lined the waterfront, storing goods awaiting shipment or distribution. Commission merchants maintained offices near the water, facilitating transactions between producers in the interior and buyers in eastern markets. The bustle of the waterfront, the arrival and departure of vessels, the movement of goods, the shouts of workers and merchants defined the rhythm of Chicago's commercial day. The central business district of Chicago in 1850 was concentrated in an area bounded roughly by the lake on the east, the main stem of the river on the north, and the South Branch on the west. Within this relatively compact area, one found the city's most substantial commercial buildings, its leading hotels, its newspaper offices, and many of its professional establishments. The buildings here were increasingly constructed of brick rather than wood, reflecting both the prosperity of their owners and concerns about fire risk in a densely built environment. Moving outward from the business center, the character of the built environment changed. Residential neighborhoods housed Chicago's growing population in structures ranging from substantial homes to modest cottages to crowded tenements. The quality of housing varied enormously, depending on the economic status of residents. Wealthy merchants and professionals built impressive residences on desirable lots, often featuring fashionable architectural styles imported from the East. Working-class families lived in simpler dwellings, frequently sharing space with other families and often lacking basic amenities. The housing stock of Chicago in 1850 was predominantly wooden construction. Lumber from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin was abundant and relatively inexpensive, making wood the practical choice for most building projects. Frame houses could be erected quickly to accommodate the rapidly growing population. However, this reliance on wood construction created significant fire hazards. Closely spaced wooden buildings, heated with wood or coal stoves, and lit with candles and oil lamps, presented obvious risks that would eventually produce catastrophic consequences. Balloon frame construction, a building technique that had emerged in Chicago during the 1830s, facilitated rapid construction. This method used standardized lumber and nails to create a light but strong structural frame, eliminating the need for heavy timber and skilled craftsmen required by traditional building methods. A small crew of workers could erect a balloon frame house in a matter of days, allowing Chicago's housing stock to expand almost as quickly as its population. The innovation spread from Chicago throughout the American West, revolutionizing residential construction across the nation. Public spaces in Chicago in 1850 remained limited. The city lacked the grand parks and boulevards that characterized older, more established cities. A public square, originally designated in the town's earliest plat, provided some open space near the center of the city. Small plots of land were reserved for various public purposes, but comprehensive park planning lay in the future. The crowded conditions of urban life offered limited respite in green spaces or recreational areas. Infrastructure for essential services remained primitive by later standards. Water supply depended on private wells and cisterns, supplemented by water drawn directly from the Chicago River or Lake Michigan. The quality of this water was often poor, contaminated by waste that found its way into water sources. A municipal waterworks would not be established until 1854, and even then, water quality would remain problematic for decades. Sanitation presented equally serious challenges. The city lacked a comprehensive sewer system, and waste disposal relied on privy vaults, cesspools, and open drainage. These primitive arrangements allowed human and animal waste to contaminate the ground, pollute water sources, and create conditions favorable to disease. The flat topography that characterized Chicago made natural drainage difficult, and waste tended to accumulate rather than flow away. Lighting in Chicago in 1850 depended on individual effort rather than public provision. Streets were dark at night, except where businesses or residents provided their own illumination. Candles, oil lamps, and lanterns lit interiors. Gas lighting, which was beginning to transform eastern cities, had not yet arrived in Chicago. The darkness of nighttime streets contributed to concerns about crime and public safety. Fire protection represented a critical need in a city built largely of wood. Volunteer fire companies provided the primary defense against fires, responding with hand-pumped engines and bucket brigades when blazes broke out. These volunteers, organized into competing companies with colorful names and fierce rivalries, represented an important institution in urban life. However, their equipment and techniques remained inadequate to the challenge of fighting major fires, particularly in the closely built commercial district, where flames could spread rapidly from building to building. The bridges spanning the Chicago River presented distinctive challenges. Drawbridges, or swing bridges, allowed river traffic to pass, but created frequent delays for street traffic. When vessels approached, the bridges would open, halting movement across the river until the ships had passed. These delays frustrated residents and businesses, and debates about bridge design and operation continued throughout the 1850s. The construction boom of the late 1840s and early 1850s transformed Chicago's appearance. Buildings rose throughout the city, replacing older structures and filling vacant lots. The pace of construction accelerated with the economic prosperity generated by canal and railroad connections. Building materials arrived continuously, lumber by the shipload, bricks from local kilns, glass and hardware from eastern manufacturers. The sounds of construction, sawing, hammering, the shouts of workers formed a constant background to urban life. Transportation connections to the outside world shaped Chicago's development in fundamental ways. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, completed in 1848, opened a water route between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River system. This canal fulfilled a vision dating back decades, creating a navigable pathway through the portage that had long connected the Great Lakes and Mississippi watersheds. Goods could now move between Chicago and New Orleans by water, dramatically expanding the markets accessible to the city's merchants. Railroad construction, just beginning in 1850, would soon transform Chicago even more dramatically. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, which had inaugurated service in 1848, was extending its lines into the agricultural areas to the west. This railroad brought wheat and other farm products to Chicago markets with a speed and reliability that wagons and canal boats could not match. Plans for additional railroad lines were advancing, and visionary leaders recognized that Chicago was destined to become the hub of a vast railroad network. Lake Michigan itself remained the dominant transportation artery for Chicago in 1850. Steamships and sailing vessels connected the city to ports throughout the Great Lakes, from Buffalo in the east to Green Bay in the north. Through the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal, Chicago maintained connections to New York and the Atlantic seaboard. The shipping season, limited by ice during winter months, determined the rhythm of Chicago's commercial year. The opening of navigation in spring brought an explosion of activity as accumulated goods moved to market and new supplies arrived. Chapter 3: Economy and Commerce. The engine of growth. The economy of Chicago in 1850 was the driving force behind the city's remarkable growth. Understanding the economic activities that defined Chicago life requires examining the various sectors that contributed to the city's commercial prominence and the people whose labor and enterprise made this economy function. Commerce, rather than manufacturing, dominated Chicago's economy in 1850. The city served as a central marketplace where the agricultural products of the surrounding region were collected, processed, and shipped to distant markets. This commercial function, facilitated by Chicago's strategic location and improving transportation connections, attracted merchants, speculators, and workers who together built the city's economic infrastructure. The grain trade stood at the center of Chicago's commercial economy. The prairies of Illinois and neighboring states produced enormous quantities of wheat, corn, and other grains that required access to markets. Chicago provided that access, serving as the collection point where farmers sold their crops to merchants who arranged shipment to eastern cities and European destinations. The volume of grain moving through Chicago grew dramatically during the late 1840s as canal and railroad connections improved. In 1850, grain arrived in Chicago by wagon, canal boat, and increasingly by railroad. Farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their crops to the city, selling to commission merchants who stored the grain in warehouses until shipment could be arranged. The process of handling, storing, and shipping grain employed numerous workers and generated profits for merchants, warehouse operators, and transportation companies. The organization of the grain trade was still evolving in 1850. The Chicago Board of Trade had been established in 1848 to bring order to commercial transactions and provide a venue for merchants to conduct business. Although it would later become world famous as a commodity exchange, in 1850 the Board of Trade was still developing its role and establishing the practices that would govern grain trading. The standardization of grain grades, the development of warehouse receipts as tradable instruments, and the emergence of futures trading all lay in the future. Lumber represented another pillar of Chicago's commercial economy. The vast forests of Wisconsin and Michigan provided seemingly inexhaustible supplies of timber that arrived in Chicago by lake and was distributed throughout the treeless prairie region. Farmers building homes, barns, and fences needed lumber that the prairies could not supply. Towns and cities throughout the Mississippi Valley depended on Chicago as a source of building materials. The lumber trade employed workers at sawmills in the north, on ships crossing the lake, and at Chicago's lumber yards, where the wood was sorted, stored, and sold. The meatpacking industry, which would later make Chicago famous as the nation's slaughterhouse, was beginning to develop in 1850. Livestock from the prairies, cattle, hogs, and sheep, arrived in Chicago for processing or shipment east. Slaughterhouses processed animals into meat products that could be preserved and transported. Pork, packed in barrels with salt, was a significant product that found markets throughout the country and overseas. The concentration of meat processing in Chicago offered advantages of scale and access to transportation that would fuel tremendous growth in subsequent decades. Retail trade served the local population and visitors from surrounding areas. Stores along the main commercial streets offered dry goods, clothing, hardware, groceries, and countless other items. Merchants maintained connections with suppliers in New York and other eastern cities, importing goods that could not be produced locally. Wholesale trade supplied retailers throughout the region, with Chicago merchants serving as intermediaries between eastern manufacturers and western consumers. Banking and financial services supported commercial activities. Banks provided capital for business ventures, facilitated transactions, and offered a range of financial services. The banking system remained relatively underdeveloped compared to eastern cities, but institutions like the Banking House of Bronson and Company and other firms served the city's financial needs. Currency in circulation included notes from various banks, creating complications for commerce and occasional losses when banks failed. The legal and professional community provided essential services to a commercial city. Lawyers handled the countless transactions, disputes, and legal matters that arose in a rapidly growing economy. Some of these lawyers would achieve national prominence, including Abraham Lincoln, who tried cases in Chicago during this period. Physicians and other professionals served the population's medical needs with the limited knowledge and techniques available at the time. Transportation industries employed substantial numbers of workers. Teamsters drove the wagons that moved goods through the city streets. Stevedores loaded and unloaded ships at the waterfront. Workers on canal boats and lake vessels transported goods between Chicago and distant ports. As railroads expanded, new occupations emerged: engineers, firemen, brakemen, and maintenance workers who kept the trains running. Construction employed many workers as Chicago's building boom continued. Carpenters, masons, painters, and laborers built the houses, commercial buildings, and public structures that accommodated the growing population. The construction industry offered opportunities for both skilled craftsmen and unskilled workers, including many recent immigrants seeking employment. Domestic service and personal services occupied a significant portion of the workforce, particularly among women and immigrants. Wealthy households employed servants to cook, clean, and manage household operations. Hotels and boarding houses required staff to attend to guests. Laundresses, seamstresses, and other workers provided services that were essential to daily life. The manufacturing sector, though less developed than commerce, was growing in 1850. Small workshops and factories produced goods for local consumption. Blacksmiths, coopers, furniture makers, and other artisans crafted products in shops scattered throughout the city. Agricultural implement manufacturers recognized the opportunity to serve the farmers of the prairie region. The McCormick Reaper Company would soon relocate to Chicago, eventually growing into one of the nation's major manufacturing enterprises. The economic life of Chicago in 1850 operated within broader patterns of boom and bust that characterized 19th century capitalism. The late 1830s had witnessed a severe depression following the Panic of 1837, which had devastated Chicago, along with the rest of the national economy. Recovery during the 1840s gradually restored prosperity, and by 1850, the economy was strong and confidence was high. However, economic instability remained a persistent risk, and future panics would again bring hardship to the city's residents. Labor conditions in Chicago reflected the broader patterns of the 19th century economy. Workers faced long hours, often laboring 12 or more hours daily. Wages varied widely depending on skill, occupation, and bargaining power. Unskilled laborers earned modest sums that barely supported basic needs. Skilled craftsmen commanded higher wages, but faced competition from immigrants and from changing production methods that threatened to undermine their positions. Working-class life in Chicago was marked by uncertainty and hardship. Employment was often irregular, particularly for unskilled workers who found jobs day by day. Seasonal fluctuations affected many industries, with winter months bringing reduced activity in construction, shipping, and other outdoor occupations. The lack of safety regulations meant that workplace accidents were common, and injured workers had little recourse or support. Illness could devastate families dependent on a single wage earner. Despite these difficulties, the economic opportunities of Chicago attracted continued migration. The city's growth generated demand for workers of all types, from laborers to professionals. Many who arrived with little quickly found opportunities to improve their circumstances. The stories of those who rose from modest origins to commercial success inspired others to try their luck in the booming city. This economic dynamism, combined with the belief in upward mobility, gave Chicago its distinctive character as a city of ambition and opportunity. Chapter 4: Daily Life and Social Structure. Understanding Chicago in 1850 requires examining how ordinary people lived, worked, and organized their lives. The social structure of the city reflected patterns of wealth, ethnicity, occupation, and gender that shaped individual experiences and collective life. The social hierarchy of Chicago in 1850 placed a small elite of merchants, professionals, and property owners at the top. These individuals controlled much of the city's wealth and exercised disproportionate influence over its political and social institutions. Many had arrived relatively early in Chicago's development, acquiring land and business interests that appreciated enormously as the city grew. Their fortunes provided comfortable living conditions, social status, and opportunities for civic leadership. The economic elite lived in substantial homes, often located in the most desirable neighborhoods near the lakefront or along fashionable streets. These residences featured amenities that distinguished them from working-class dwellings, multiple rooms, quality furnishings, and servants to handle household tasks. The wealthy entertained at home, hosting dinners and social gatherings that reinforced their position in the social hierarchy. A substantial middle class of small merchants, clerks, professionals, and skilled artisans occupied the middle ranks of Chicago society. These families lived comfortably, but without the luxury enjoyed by the elite. They often owned their own homes, modest frame structures that provided adequate shelter and some privacy. Middle-class families typically could afford to keep a servant, often a young immigrant woman who helped with household work. The working class constituted the majority of Chicago's population. Laborers, factory workers, domestic servants, and others in low-paying occupations struggled to meet basic needs on their wages. Housing for working-class families was often crowded, with multiple families sharing buildings and even individual rooms. The poorest residents lived in areas characterized by substandard housing, poor sanitation, and limited access to city services. Gender shaped experiences in fundamental ways. Men dominated the public sphere of commerce, politics, and civic life. Women were expected to focus on domestic responsibilities, though economic necessity often required working-class women to seek employment outside the home. Married women had limited legal rights, with their property and earnings subject to their husband's control under the common law of the time. Single women could own property and conduct business, but faced significant social constraints and economic disadvantages. The domestic sphere remained the primary realm of respectable middle-class and elite women. Managing a household involved considerable work, overseeing servants, directing food preparation, maintaining cleanliness, caring for children, and managing household finances. Women also played important roles in churches and charitable organizations, extending their domestic responsibilities into the community. Working-class women often had no choice but to work for wages. Many found employment as domestic servants, working in the households of wealthier families. Others worked as seamstresses, laundresses, or in other service occupations. Factory work, though less common for women than it would become in later decades, offered some employment opportunities. The wages women earned were typically far lower than those paid to men for comparable work. Children in Chicago in 1850 faced circumstances that varied dramatically based on their family's economic status. Children of the wealthy enjoyed educational opportunities, comfortable homes, and some leisure time for play. Middle-class children often attended school and helped with household chores. Working-class children frequently began working at young ages, contributing to family income through paid employment or helping with family enterprises. Child labor laws did not exist, and children as young as 8 or 10 might work long hours in factories, shops, or other workplaces. The ethnic diversity of Chicago created distinct communities within the city. The Irish, concentrated in certain neighborhoods, maintained their own social institutions, churches, and cultural traditions. Discrimination against the Irish was widespread and virulent. Native-born Americans viewed Irish immigrants as racially inferior, morally suspect, and economically threatening. Signs announcing "No Irish Need Apply" expressed attitudes that limited Irish access to better jobs and neighborhoods. German immigrants formed another significant community with distinctive characteristics. Many Germans brought skills in trades and crafts that facilitated their economic advancement. German neighborhoods featured businesses, churches, and cultural organizations that preserved German language and customs. Germans established breweries and beer gardens that became important social venues. The German community maintained closer ties to homeland culture than did many other immigrant groups. Social tensions between native-born Americans and immigrants, and among different immigrant groups, created ongoing conflicts. Competition for jobs and housing generated resentment. Religious differences, particularly between Protestants and Catholics, produced suspicion and hostility. Political divisions often aligned with ethnic identities. Occasional violence erupted when tensions boiled over, though large-scale riots remained relatively rare. The daily routine of Chicago life was shaped by the demands of work. Most people worked 6 days a week, with only Sunday offering respite from labor. The workday began early, often at sunrise or even before, and continued until evening. There was little distinction between work time and personal time for many workers, whose labor consumed most of their waking hours. Food in Chicago reflected the city's role as an agricultural marketplace. Basic provisions, meat, bread, vegetables, and dairy products, were readily available, though quality and variety depended on economic means. Street vendors sold prepared foods to workers and travelers. Restaurants and hotels served those who could afford to dine out. Home cooking remained the norm for most families, with women spending considerable time and effort on food preparation. Clothing similarly reflected economic status and cultural background. The wealthy dressed in fashionable styles imported from eastern cities and Europe, with men wearing suits and women in elaborate dresses with multiple petticoats. Working-class clothing was simpler and more durable, designed for practical use rather than display. Immigrants sometimes retained traditional dress from their homelands, though pressure to conform to American styles was strong. Housing conditions ranged from the comfortable to the deplorable. The best homes offered multiple rooms, quality construction, and some modern conveniences. Middle-class housing provided adequate shelter and privacy for families. Working-class housing was often overcrowded, poorly constructed, and lacking basic sanitation. The poorest residents lived in conditions that barely met basic human needs. Entertainment and recreation provided respite from the demands of daily life. Theaters presented dramatic performances, concerts, and variety shows. Saloons offered social gathering places where men drank, smoked, and engaged in conversation. Churches organized social events and gatherings that brought community members together. Holidays, including the 4th of July and various ethnic celebrations, offered occasions for public festivity. Crime and vice were persistent concerns in Chicago. Gambling, prostitution, and illegal liquor sales flourished in certain quarters. Theft and violence were common enough to create anxiety about public safety. The city's law enforcement resources remained limited, with a small police force unable to effectively patrol the growing urban area. Vigilante justice occasionally supplemented official law enforcement when citizens took matters into their own hands. Public health posed serious challenges. Disease, including cholera, typhoid fever, smallpox, and various other illnesses, struck frequently and sometimes devastatingly. The cholera epidemic of 1850 killed hundreds of Chicago residents, highlighting the city's vulnerability to contagious disease. Medical knowledge remained primitive, and effective treatments for many diseases did not exist. Poor sanitation and contaminated water contributed to disease transmission, though the connections between sanitation and health were not yet fully understood. Death was a familiar presence in Chicago life. Infant mortality rates were high, with many children dying before reaching their first birthday. Adults faced risks from disease, accidents, violence, and childbirth. The average life expectancy was far shorter than modern standards, and few families escaped the experience of losing loved ones. Churches provided comfort and community support in times of grief, and cemeteries received a steady stream of new burials. Chapter 5: Politics, Governance, and Law. The political life of Chicago in 1850 reflected both local concerns and the national issues that were increasingly dividing the United States. Understanding how the city was governed and how its residents participated in political life illuminates important aspects of Chicago in this pivotal year. Chicago operated under a city charter granted by the Illinois State Legislature. This charter established the basic framework of government, defining powers and procedures for municipal administration. The charter could be amended only by action of the state legislature, limiting the city's autonomy and requiring Chicago leaders to cultivate relationships with state politicians in Springfield. The mayor served as Chicago's chief executive officer, elected by popular vote for a one-year term. The mayor presided over the Common Council, enforced city ordinances, and represented the city in various capacities. The office carried limited formal powers, with much authority vested in the council, but the mayor's public visibility gave the position significant influence. The rapid turnover resulting from annual elections meant that the office changed hands frequently, limiting any individual mayor's ability to implement long-term plans. The Common Council exercised legislative authority over city affairs. Aldermen, elected from each of the city's wards, met regularly to consider ordinances, approve expenditures, and address the numerous issues confronting a growing city. Council meetings could be contentious, with aldermen representing different wards, constituencies, and interests engaging in vigorous debate. The quality of aldermanic service varied widely, with some officials serving the public interest and others pursuing personal advantage. The services provided by city government in 1850 remained quite limited by later standards. Street maintenance, such as it was, fell within city jurisdiction. Fire protection relied primarily on volunteer companies, though the city provided some support. A small police force attempted to maintain public order. The city regulated certain commercial activities and licensed various businesses. Beyond these basic functions, city government played a limited role in residents' lives. Taxation provided the revenue to support city operations, but fiscal resources remained constrained. Property taxes, assessed on real estate and personal property, generated most municipal revenue. Commercial license fees and various charges supplemented tax collections. The city's limited tax base restricted what services could be provided, forcing difficult choices about priorities and leaving many needs unmet. Political parties organized much of the political activity in Chicago. The Democratic Party, associated nationally with Andrew Jackson and his successors, dominated Chicago politics through much of the 1840s. Democrats drew support from immigrant communities, particularly the Irish, and from working-class voters who appreciated the party's populist rhetoric and resistance to moral reform campaigns. The Whig Party represented commercial and professional interests in Chicago, as it did nationally. Whigs generally favored government support for internal improvements, including transportation infrastructure that would benefit commerce. Many Whig leaders came from New England, and brought with them the reform orientation of Yankee culture. The Whig Party struggled to achieve consistent electoral success in Chicago, but remained competitive in many contests. Local political issues in 1850 included debates over streets and infrastructure, liquor licensing and temperance, public health and sanitation, and the distribution of city resources among different neighborhoods and interests. Aldermen advocated for improvements in their wards, leading to negotiations and compromises over municipal priorities. Special interests, including business groups and ethnic organizations, sought favorable treatment from city government. Teacher qualifications varied widely, with many teachers having little formal training for their work. Pay was low, and teaching was often viewed as temporary employment rather than a career. School buildings in 1850 were often inadequate to their purposes. Crowded classrooms, poor ventilation, and limited supplies hindered effective instruction. The school year was shorter than modern standards, and attendance was irregular as many children worked to support their families. Educational quality depended heavily on individual teachers and the resources available in particular schools. Private academies offered alternatives for families who could afford tuition. These schools often provided higher quality instruction and smaller classes than public schools. Some specialized in preparing students for college or professional careers. Young women could attend female seminaries that offered education deemed appropriate for their gender, including instruction in domestic arts, alongside academic subjects. Catholic parishes operated schools that served immigrant communities. These parochial schools provided instruction in Catholic doctrine alongside basic academic subjects for Irish and German immigrants who faced discrimination in public schools and sought to maintain their religious heritage. Parochial schools offered important alternatives. The establishment of Catholic schools reflected both religious conviction and practical necessity. Higher education was virtually unavailable in Chicago in 1850. The city lacked colleges or universities, and young people seeking advanced education had to travel to established institutions in other cities. The University of Chicago would not be founded until 1856, and it would struggle initially before failing and later being reorganized. Professional training in law, medicine, and ministry generally required study elsewhere. Literacy rates in Chicago reflected broader patterns in American society. Most native-born white adults could read and write at basic levels, though functional literacy varied considerably. Immigrants, particularly those from rural backgrounds, sometimes had limited literacy in any language. Educational opportunities for African Americans were extremely limited, reflecting the broader discrimination they faced in Northern society. The intellectual life of Chicago in 1850 included various organizations and activities that brought together those interested in literature, science, and ideas. The Chicago Lyceum and similar organizations sponsored lectures and debates on topics of public interest. Traveling lecturers brought speakers of national reputation to Chicago audiences. Literary and scientific societies provided forums for discussion and presentation. Newspapers served as important cultural institutions, providing not only news, but also commentary, literary content, and connections to the wider world. The Chicago Tribune, founded in 1847, was emerging as one of the city's leading papers. The Chicago Democrat, the Daily Journal, and other papers offered alternative perspectives and competed for readers. Newspaper editors wielded significant influence, shaping public opinion and participating actively in political life. Libraries in Chicago remained limited. No public library existed. Access to books depended on private collections, subscription libraries, or occasional reading rooms. Those who could afford to purchase books might accumulate personal libraries, but reading materials remained expensive and not universally accessible. The establishment of a comprehensive public library lay years in the future. The arts had begun to establish a presence in Chicago, though cultural institutions remained modest compared to eastern cities. Theaters presented dramatic performances, with touring companies bringing productions from eastern cities. Musical performances, including concerts and operatic productions, attracted audiences who appreciated refined entertainment. Local artists, musicians, and writers pursued their crafts, though opportunities for cultural production remained limited. Popular entertainment appealed to broad audiences. Saloons and beer gardens offered social gathering places with music and conviviality. Circuses and traveling shows brought spectacular entertainment to eager crowds. Sports and athletic competitions attracted participants and spectators. Public celebrations, including 4th of July festivities and ethnic community events, provided occasions for communal enjoyment. Chapter 7: Challenges, Struggles, and the Road Ahead. As 1850 drew to a close, Chicago faced significant challenges while looking toward a future filled with both promise and uncertainty. Understanding these challenges and anticipating developments that would shape the coming decades provides important perspective on where Chicago stood at this pivotal moment. Public health represented one of the most serious challenges facing Chicago in 1850. The cholera epidemic that struck that year killed hundreds of residents and revealed the city's vulnerability to contagious disease. Cholera, caused by contaminated water, spread rapidly through a population that lacked understanding of disease transmission and had no effective treatment. The epidemic of 1850 was neither the first nor the last that would strike Chicago, and the threat of disease remained a persistent concern. The underlying causes of epidemic disease, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and crowded living conditions would require decades of effort to address. In 1850, the connections between sanitation and health were not yet clearly understood. The germ theory of disease lay in the future, and many attributed illness to miasmas, bad air, or moral failings. Progress in public health would require both scientific advances and substantial investments in infrastructure that were beyond the resources of 1850. The physical infrastructure of the city required enormous improvement. Streets remained unpaved, liable to become impassable mud during wet weather and dusty nuisances during dry periods. Drainage was poor, allowing standing water to accumulate and create unhealthy conditions. A comprehensive solution to Chicago's drainage problems would require raising the grade of the entire city, an engineering feat that would be undertaken in subsequent decades. Water supply and sewerage presented related challenges. The city lacked a municipal waterworks to provide clean water to residents. Private wells and direct drawing from the river or lake provided water of questionable quality. A sewer system did not exist, and waste disposal relied on primitive methods that contaminated water sources and created nuisances. Building the infrastructure to provide water and remove waste would require substantial investment and engineering expertise. Fire risk loomed over a city built largely of wood. The closely spaced wooden buildings, the prevalence of open flames for heating and lighting, and the limited capacity of volunteer fire companies created conditions for catastrophic fires. Major fires had already occurred, destroying buildings and causing significant losses. The Great Fire that would devastate the city lay 2 decades in the future, but the conditions that would produce that catastrophe were already present. Crime and public safety concerned many residents. The limited police force could not effectively patrol the growing city. Criminal activity flourished in certain quarters, and residents worried about their security. Improving law enforcement would require expanding the police force, professionalizing its operations, and addressing the social conditions that contributed to crime. Social tensions, particularly those involving ethnic and religious differences, threatened community harmony. Discrimination against immigrants, especially the Irish, created resentment and conflict. Competition for jobs, housing, and political power exacerbated tensions. Building a cohesive community from diverse populations would require effort and time that the rapidly growing city could barely spare. The national crisis over slavery cast a shadow over Chicago's future. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily settled some immediate disputes, but the underlying conflict between free and slave states continued to deepen. Chicago, located in a free state with strong anti-slavery sentiment, would be drawn into the national drama that culminated in civil war. The political realignment that produced the Republican Party would transform Chicago politics, and the city's residents would contribute funds and resources to the Union cause. Despite these challenges, the outlook for Chicago remained overwhelmingly positive in the eyes of most observers. The city's growth showed no signs of slowing. Railroad construction promised to multiply the advantages of Chicago's location, making it the hub of a vast transportation network. The agricultural development of the prairies continued to generate commerce that flowed through Chicago. Eastern capital was flowing westward, seeking opportunities in the booming city. The railroad transformation that would make Chicago the nation's railroad capital was just beginning. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad was expanding, and plans for additional lines were advancing. The Illinois Central Railroad, chartered in 1851, would create a major north-south route that enhanced Chicago's position. By the end of the decade, Chicago would be connected by rail to virtually every part of the nation, with more railroad traffic than any other American city. Industrial development, though still secondary to commerce, would accelerate in coming years. The McCormick Reaper Company's relocation to Chicago in 1847 foreshadowed industrial growth based on serving agricultural markets. Manufacturing establishments would multiply, producing agricultural implements, processed foods, building materials, and countless other goods. The transition from a commercial to an industrial economy would transform Chicago's character. Population growth would continue at a remarkable pace. The 30,000 residents of 1850 would become over 100,000 by 1860 and exceed 1 million before the end of the century. This growth would transform the city's physical extent, social composition, and political importance. Chicago would become one of the great cities of the world, a transformation that was already underway in 1850. The challenges of governance would intensify as the city grew. The limited government of 1850 would prove inadequate to the needs of a large metropolitan area. New approaches to municipal administration, service provision, and urban planning would emerge from necessity. The professionalization of city services, the development of regulatory frameworks, and the expansion of municipal functions would all follow in subsequent decades. Cultural institutions would mature as the city's population and wealth grew. Schools, libraries, museums, and universities would be established and expanded. The cultural life of Chicago would develop from its modest 1850 beginnings to rival that of older cities. Architecture, music, literature, and the arts would flourish in the maturing metropolis. As 1850 ended, Chicago stood at a crossroads in its history. The foundations of a great city had been laid. The transportation connections, commercial relationships, and demographic momentum that would drive continued growth were in place. Challenges remained formidable, but the spirit of enterprise and optimism that characterized the city suggested they would be overcome. The Chicago of 1850 was a city in transition, still marked by frontier roughness, but already displaying the energy and ambition that would make it a world-class metropolis. Those who lived there, whether native-born Americans or recent immigrants, whether wealthy merchants or struggling laborers, were participating in the creation of something remarkable. Their efforts, their struggles, and their achievements would shape not only Chicago, but also the nation and the world. The story of Chicago in 1850 is ultimately a story of human endeavor, of people who saw opportunity in a challenging environment and worked to realize their visions. It is a story of commerce and industry, of politics and governance, of religion and culture, of struggle and achievement. It is a story that was still unfolding in 1850, with the most dramatic chapters yet to be written, but the characters, the setting, and the themes were already established, waiting for the events that would bring them to fulfillment in the decades ahead. Conclusion. Chicago, in 1850, was a city of remarkable contrasts and tremendous potential. With a population approaching 30,000, it had grown from a small frontier settlement to a significant urban center in less than 2 decades. Its strategic location at the junction of the Great Lakes and the Prairie Heartland made it uniquely positioned to benefit from American westward expansion. The economy of Chicago in 1850 centered on commerce, particularly the grain trade that connected prairie farmers to eastern and international markets. The Illinois and Michigan Canal had opened new transportation routes, and railroad construction was beginning to transform the city's position in the national economy. These developments promised even greater growth in the years ahead. Daily life in Chicago reflected the city's youth and diversity. Wealthy merchants lived in substantial homes, while working-class families crowded into modest dwellings. Irish, German, and other immigrants joined native-born Americans in building the city's economy and institutions. Social tensions existed, but opportunity drew continued migration from across the nation and around the world. The challenges facing Chicago were substantial: public health threats, inadequate infrastructure, fire risk, crime, and social conflict all demanded attention. But the city's residents faced these challenges with confidence, believing that their efforts would be rewarded and that Chicago's best days lay ahead. The Chicago of 1850 was not yet the great metropolis it would become, but the essential character of that future city was already taking shape. The energy, ambition, and enterprise that would build one of America's greatest cities were already evident in the muddy streets and busy waterfront of this young prairie town. The story of Chicago was just beginning, and 1850 marked an important chapter in that continuing narrative.